At the far end of a crowded shelter, one German shepherd lay beside a bowl he refused to touch. He never barked, he never begged, he only watched the door, and lifted his head whenever three sharp sounds echoed through the hallway. Most people assumed Max had simply given up. But when former Navy SEAL Matthew Brooks dropped a wrench and heard it strike the concrete 3 times, the starving dog suddenly stood. Who was Max waiting for? Why did those 3 sounds matter more than food? And what would Matthew discover when he followed the only clue the silent dog had left him? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late autumn rested lightly over Lexington, Kentucky, beneath a pale sky that promised colder days without delivering them yet. Brown leaves gathered along the curbs, the wind smelled faintly of rain and wood smoke, and Bluegrass Animal Haven stood at the edge of town behind a weathered white fence. The shelter was not beautiful, but it was clean, stubbornly cheerful, and held together by donated paint, overworked heaters, and people who had learned to repair almost anything except a broken heart. Matthew Brooks arrived carrying a steel toolbox in one hand and a paper cup of coffee in the other. At 41, the former Navy SEAL still moved with the controlled economy of a man trained never to waste a step. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a powerful build that had softened only slightly since leaving active service. His dark brown hair was clipped short, a few strands of gray beginning to show near the temples. A neatly trimmed beard framed a square jaw, and a faint scar crossed the skin beneath his right ear. His blue-gray eyes noticed exits, loose hinges, uneven floorboards, and people's hands before they noticed their faces. Matthew was polite with strangers, but rarely warm. He did not dislike people. He simply found them difficult to repair. A broken latch required a new spring. A warped door needed sanding. Human beings carried wounds that changed shape whenever someone reached for them. Matthew had once believed discipline could solve nearly everything. Then his wife became ill, and he discovered there were battles in which perfect schedules, correct medications, and relentless effort still ended in loss. Since her death, he had kept his days crowded with short jobs and practical tasks. Empty hours invited memories, and memories had a way of entering without knocking. He had agreed to spend 3 days replacing damaged locks and reinforcing kennel doors before winter. 3 days were manageable. 3 days had a beginning, a checklist, and an end. The first half of the kennel row greeted him with barking. Dogs pressed their paws against the gates, tails striking the wire, voices rising together in a noisy argument over who deserved to be noticed first. Matthew set down his coffee and studied the nearest latch. "You always look that cheerful," a woman said behind him. "Or did someone steal your last donut?" Matthew turned. Dorothy Lane was 72, short and softly built, with warm brown skin marked by fine lines around her mouth and eyes. Her silver-white hair was gathered into a loose bun that appeared to have surrendered sometime before lunch. She tore faded jeans, a sunflower yellow sweater beneath a blue volunteer apron, and red reading glasses on a chain around her neck. There was flour on one sleeve and dog hair on the other. Dorothy's humor arrived quickly, often before anyone could ask how she was feeling. "I don't eat many donuts," Matthew said. "That explains the face. You look serious enough to make a vending machine return everybody's money." Matthew glanced at her, uncertain whether she expected an answer. Dorothy smiled. "Don't worry. I've met quiet men before. My husband was quiet for 46 years, though he made up for it by snoring like farm equipment." She turned toward the laundry room before Matthew could respond. The joke floated behind her, light enough to make the hallway feel less institutional. What Matthew could not see was the moment Dorothy's smile faded after she turned away. Her husband, Harold, had died 9 months earlier. She still volunteered until closing because going home meant opening a door to a house where no voice asked whether she had remembered the milk. During the day, Dorothy spoke enough for 2 people. At night, the silence always collected its share. Matthew worked down the row, removing rusted screws and testing hinges. Near the far end, a small terrier hurled himself against the gate, as if personally offended by Matthew's existence. The dog was perhaps 3 years old, white, with tan patches over one eye and along his narrow back. His name card read Benny. He had bright black eyes, wiry fur, thin legs, and more energy than his little body seemed designed to contain. Benny barked, spun in a circle, pressed his nose through the bars, then barked again. "You've made your point," Matthew told him. Benny responded with greater volume. A few visitors paused to laugh. One woman crouched to take a picture. A boy waved both hands, delighted when Benny jumped higher. Then they moved on without noticing the kennel beside him. That was where Matthew saw the German Shepherd. The dog lay close to the gate rather than hiding against the back wall. He was a 5-year-old male with black and tan markings that should have appeared rich and glossy. Instead, his coat looked dull, the darker fur faded by poor nutrition and stress. His body was long and once powerful, but his ribs showed beneath his sides, and the muscles around his hips had wasted away. His ears remained upright, though one leaned slightly outward when he rested. His eyes were deep brown, intelligent and painfully alert. The card on the kennel read, Max. A stainless steel bowl sat near his front paws, filled with warmed food and small pieces of chicken. Max did not look at it. He watched the hallway. Footsteps approached from the lobby. Max lifted his head. His ears moved forward, and for one brief second, his entire face changed. Hope was difficult to mistake in an animal. It was cleaner than human hope, without pride to disguise it. A young couple appeared at the end of the row. Max stared. They stopped at Benny's kennel instead. The terrier launched into another performance, bouncing and whining until the couple laughed. Max held his head up a moment longer, then lowered it carefully onto his paws. Matthew looked from the dog to the untouched bowl. "How long?" he asked when Dorothy returned with folded blankets. "Almost 6 weeks. He hasn't eaten in 6 weeks." "Not properly." Dorothy placed the blankets on a shelf. "The staff have tried soft food, dry food, broth, chicken, beef, food warmed up, food cooled down, food served on plates instead of bowls. The veterinarian ran tests. Max gets fluids and assisted feeding when necessary. His body is still here. The rest of him seems to be waiting somewhere else." Matthew crouched outside the gate. Max did not shrink back or bare his teeth. He glanced at Matthew, then returned his attention to the hallway. "Open it," Matthew said. Dorothy hesitated. "He isn't dangerous." "I didn't say he was." "No, but people see a large German Shepherd and start writing a whole story before the dog gets a line." Matthew understood that. People had done something similar with him. They saw the posture, the scar, the military record, and decided he was either heroic or damaged. Few considered that he might simply be tired. Dorothy unlocked the kennel and remained by the gate. Matthew stepped inside slowly. Max watched him without fear and without interest. Matthew moved the bowl closer. "Max." One ear shifted toward his voice. "Eat." The command was calm, low, and clear. It had once been the kind of voice people obeyed before they had time to question it. Max looked past him toward the door. Matthew changed the angle of the bowl, examined the food, then moved it away from the draft. He waited several seconds and repeated the command. Max did not resist. Resistance would have acknowledged the contest. The dog simply behaved as if Matthew's solution belonged to a problem that did not exist. That indifference irritated him more than defiance would have. Matthew understood conflict. Conflict provided something to push against. He tried again with the piece of chicken held between 2 fingers. Max sniffed once but did not open his mouth. "You can't order grief to eat," Dorothy said quietly. Matthew looked back at her. "I'm not calling it grief." "Of course not. Grief is untidy. You probably prefer words with instructions attached." Her tone remained gentle, but the truth in it landed harder than Matthew expected. He placed the chicken back in the bowl and stood. Max's eyes never followed his hand. They returned to the hallway. For the next hour, Matthew worked on the lock beside Max's kennel. Benny continued barking whenever anyone entered, and Max continued lifting his head for every set of footsteps. Some visitors saw the shepherd and frowned with sympathy. Others looked away quickly. Human beings often mistook noticing suffering for helping it. They paused long enough to feel sad, then left before sadness demanded anything inconvenient. Matthew removed the damaged latch and reached for a smaller wrench. A screw slipped beneath the frame. When he bent to retrieve it, the wrench slid from the top of his toolbox and struck the concrete. Clack. It bounced. Clack. The metal turned once more and landed. Clack. Max sprang to his feet. The movement was so sudden that Benny stopped barking. Max stood rigid, ribs rising beneath his thin coat, ears pointed toward the far end of the hallway. His eyes widened. He took one step toward the gate, then another. For several seconds he seemed no longer weak. Every part of him listened. No one appeared. The hallway returned to its ordinary sounds, a washing machine turning, a distant telephone ringing, rain beginning softly against the windows. Max waited until the silence became undeniable. Then the strength left his posture. He lowered himself to the floor and rested his head beside the untouched bowl. Matthew remained crouched over the fallen wrench. He had been wrong. Max had not stopped caring whether the world came back for him. The dog was listening for something specific. 3 sharp sounds, spaced just far enough apart to carry a promise. Matthew picked up the wrench, but he did not return to the lock. For the first time since arriving, he looked down the empty hallway the way Max did, and wondered who was supposed to come through that door. Morning came gray and damp over Lexington, with a thin rain tapping against the shelter windows and turning the parking lot into a sheet of dark reflections. Bluegrass Animal Haven smelled of disinfectant, wet fur, and the first pot of coffee Dorothy Lane had brewed before anyone else arrived. Matthew Brooks had slept badly. The sound of the wrench striking concrete had followed him home, 3 clean notes repeating in the quiet rooms of his house. By sunrise, he had stopped pretending the dog at the end of the kennel row was none of his concern. Max was awake when Matthew entered the corridor. The German shepherd lay in the same place beside the gate, his head resting near the untouched bowl. Nothing about his position looked dramatic. That was what made it difficult to ignore. Suffering often looked smaller than people expected. It did not always cry out or collapse in public. Sometimes it simply remained in the same place long enough for everyone else to grow accustomed to it. Benny announced Matthew's arrival with a burst of barking. The little terrier jumped against the wire, spun once, then did it again, as if the first performance might not have been convincing enough. "Good morning to you too," Matthew said. Benny barked louder. Max lifted his head, but his attention moved past Matthew toward the main door. When no familiar figure appeared, one ear tilted outward and his chin lowered again. Matthew found Rachel Moore in the small office behind the reception desk. Rachel was 38, tall and lean, with freckled fair skin, hazel eyes, and straight auburn hair cut just above her shoulders. She wore dark work pants, waterproof boots, and a navy pullover with the shelter logo stitched over the chest. Her face carried the tired alertness of someone who had spent years making decisions with too little money and too many lives depending on them. Rachel was patient with frightened animals, direct with careless people, and suspicious of anyone who arrived believing kindness alone qualified them to make difficult choices. Before managing the shelter, she had worked as a veterinary technician. A severe kennel fire case early in her career had taught her that good intentions without careful records could become another form of harm. "I want Max's intake file," Matthew said. Rachel looked up from a stack of medication logs. "You're here to repair doors. I repaired 3 yesterday. There are 9 left. I can read and use a screwdriver in the same day." Rachel studied him for a moment. Why the sudden interest? 3 sounds made him stand up. Many sounds make dogs react. Not like that. Rachel leaned back in her chair. You've known him for half a day. That doesn't make what I saw less true. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but evaluation. Matthew recognized the look. It was the same expression instructors once used before deciding whether a man was observant or merely confident. Rachel opened a locked filing cabinet and removed a thick folder. You can read it here. Nothing leaves the office, and you don't contact anyone without going through me. Matthew sat at the desk opposite her. The first pages held veterinary results, weight charts, feeding notes, and daily observations. Max had arrived 6 weeks earlier at nearly 20 pounds below a healthy weight for his frame. No intestinal blockage, no advanced organ disease, no injury severe enough to explain the refusal to eat. The shelter veterinarian had prescribed fluids and assisted feeding when Max's strength dropped too far. Staff members had recorded every attempt. Warmed chicken, canned food, broth, hand feeding, quiet rooms, company, solitude. The entries grew shorter as the days passed, as though even written hope became difficult to sustain. Then Matthew reached the intake history. Max had belonged to Helen Carter, 79, a retired elementary school teacher who had lived in a modest brick house on the south side of Lexington. A photograph had been clipped to the form. Helen was a small, fine-boned woman with light brown skin, soft gray curls, and a narrow face brightened by a mischievous smile. She wore a green cardigan and held one hand against Max's broad chest. Even in the still image, Max leaned toward her as though his balance depended on knowing where she stood. A note identified Helen as patient, private, and fiercely independent. She had taught second grade for 34 years and was known for keeping peppermints in her desk for children who cried on the first day of school. Arthritis had weakened her left knee, so she walked with a wooden cane. 6 weeks before Max entered the shelter, Helen had suffered a stroke in her kitchen. According to the report, Max remained beside her for nearly 2 days. He had not scratched the door or escaped through the yard. He had stayed in the room with her, leaving only long enough to drink from the bathroom toilet. A mail carrier noticed newspapers accumulating on the porch and saw unopened curtains at midday. After getting no response, he contacted a neighbor who called emergency services. Helen survived. She was taken first to a hospital, then transferred to Maple Grove Rehabilitation Center. Matthew paused at the sentence. She's alive? Rachel nodded. As far as the last update says. Then why is the dog here? Keep reading. Helen's son, David Carter, had taken Max to his apartment after the hospitalization. The file contained a copy of David's identification and a short statement written in hurried block letters. He was 53 and worked as a warehouse supervisor. In the attached photograph, David had a heavy frame, thinning dark hair, tired brown eyes, and a trimmed mustache already turning gray. His face looked stern until one noticed the strain around his mouth. He had inherited none of Helen's visible lightness. David's apartment building prohibited dogs over 40 pounds. The property manager allowed Max to remain temporarily, but complaints began after the German Shepherd rushed into the hallway whenever he heard a cane, walker, or hard-soled shoe striking the floor. Max did not attack anyone. He simply ran to each sound, searched the person's face, then returned to the apartment door. He also stopped eating. David contacted foster groups, breed rescues, and people from Helen's church. Several homes were willing to consider him until they learned he refused food and spent most of the day waiting by the entrance. After 3 weeks, the building issued a final notice. David surrendered Max to Bluegrass Animal Haven and promised to remain reachable. He visited once, Rachel said, 3 days after the intake. And after that, he called twice. Matthew closed the folder halfway. He left him. Rachel's expression hardened. Be careful with simple conclusions. They're usually comfortable because someone else has to live inside them. He knew the dog was waiting. He also had a mother in rehabilitation, a job he couldn't lose, and a landlord threatening eviction. I'm not defending every decision. I'm telling you the file is not a human soul. It is paper describing the edges. Matthew disliked the answer because it was reasonable. From the hallway came Benny's frantic barking, followed by Dorothy's voice. "You've already been seen, Benjamin. The entire county has received your announcement." A moment later, Dorothy appeared in the office doorway, carrying folded towels. Her silver hair was escaping its bun in 3 directions. "You two solving the world without me?" she asked. "Max belonged to a woman who had a stroke," Matthew said. Dorothy's humor faded. "Helen Carter? You knew her?" "Not well. She donated old blankets here, always washed and folded. She used to bring dog biscuits in a cookie tin and warn us not to eat them, which means she understood volunteers perfectly." Rachel turned another page in the file. "There's a video attached to the intake email. David sent it so staff could see Max before the stroke." Matthew looked at the office computer. Rachel hesitated. "It may help, or it may not. Play it." She opened the digital record. The video lasted less than 30 seconds. It showed the front room of Helen's house in warm afternoon light. Max lay near a sofa, healthier then, his coat dark and polished. Through the glass storm door, Helen appeared on the porch carrying a canvas shopping bag. Before opening the door, she tapped the rubber tip of her cane against the wooden threshold. Knock, knock, knock. Max sprang up, tail sweeping behind him. Helen laughed as she entered. "There's my handsome boy," she said in the recording. The video ended. Matthew watched it again without sound, focusing on Max's posture. The dog had not responded merely to the door. His body changed at the 3 taps, before Helen stepped inside. "That's what he heard yesterday," Matthew said. Rachel folded her arms. "Probably." Dorothy stood quietly beside the desk. "People build little signals without realizing it. A key turning a certain way, a cough in the hallway, 3 steps on a porch. Then one day the sound stops, and the one left behind is the only one who knows something enormous has gone missing." The kennel corridor had grown quiet. Matthew glanced toward it. Benny was no longer barking. Dorothy noticed too. "Watch him when no one's walking through." They stepped into the hall. Without visitors nearby, Benny had abandoned the front of his kennel. He was curled against the dividing wall beside Max, his thin body trembling beneath wiry fur. The terrier pressed one side of himself against the concrete, as though trying to feel the larger dog through it. "He's loud because people reward loud," Dorothy said, "but when they leave, he gets scared of the silence." Max lay on the other side of the wall, close enough that their bodies were separated by only a few inches of concrete. Matthew considered the 2 animals. Benny shouted into the world so it could not forget him. Max had stopped calling, yet every part of him remained turned toward the person he expected to return. Human beings did the same thing. In more respectable forms, some filled every room with words, others answered every question with silence. Both could be asking not to be left alone. Matthew returned to the office and transferred the video to his phone with Rachel's permission. Near midday, he sat outside Max's kennel. Dorothy remained several yards away with Benny, who had resumed barking now that 2 people were present. Matthew lowered the volume and pressed play. The faint sounds of Helen's house came through the speaker. Then the cane struck the threshold. Knock, knock, knock. Max stood immediately. His weakness disappeared beneath the force of expectation. He stepped to the gate, ears pointed forward, eyes fixed down the corridor. His breathing quickened. For one terrible second, hope restored the dog Matthew had seen in the video. But the hallway remained empty. No green cardigan, no canvas bag, no small woman leaning on a wooden cane. The video continued long enough for Helen's recorded voice to say, "There's my handsome boy." Max looked at Matthew. The expression was not accusation. That would have been easier to bear. It was confusion, the helpless confusion of a creature who had heard a promise but could not find the person attached to it. The screen went dark. Max looked toward the door one last time, then stepped backward. He lowered himself beside the full bowl and turned his face away from the phone. Matthew stopped the recording. He had wanted information. He had found it, yet information without the power to change what followed had become another kind of cruelty. 3 knocks could explain why Max waited. They could not become Helen, and by playing them without bringing her through the door, Matthew had not comforted the dog. He had only made Max lose her again. The rain had stopped over Lexington, but the morning remained colorless, with low clouds hanging above the city and water slipping from bare branches onto the sidewalks. Matthew Brooks arrived at Bluegrass Animal Haven earlier than usual, carrying no toolbox. That alone made Rachel Moore look up from the reception desk. Matthew asked her to contact David Carter and arrange a meeting. Rachel reminded him that reading a file did not give him permission to interfere in someone else's life. But she also knew Max's condition was worsening. After a brief phone call, David agreed to meet at a diner near Maple Grove Rehabilitation Center during his lunch break. The diner stood between a pharmacy and a tire shop, its front windows fogged by coffee steam and the warmth of the kitchen. David was already seated in a booth near the back when Matthew entered. At 53, David Carter was a heavy-set man with broad hands, thinning black hair combed carefully over a widening crown, and a square face made older by exhaustion. A gray-streaked mustache covered his upper lip. His brown eyes were bloodshot, and the skin beneath them had the bruised darkness of someone who slept in short, guilty pieces. He wore steel-toed work boots, a faded warehouse jacket, and a blue uniform shirt with a name patch sewn above the pocket. David's shoulders had the permanent forward bend of a man accustomed to lifting things too heavy to carry alone. Matthew sat opposite him. "You're the Navy man from the shelter," David said. "Former Navy. Rachel said you were helping with Max?" "I'm trying to understand why he's there." David's mouth tightened. "That sounds like a polite way of asking why I abandoned him." Matthew did not deny it. A waitress placed 2 cups of coffee on the table. David wrapped both hands around his cup but did not drink. Matthew noticed the cracked skin around his fingers, the faint grease beneath his nails, and the stiffness with which he flexed his right wrist. Nothing about him suggested comfort or carelessness. "My mother had the stroke on a Tuesday," David began. "I was at work. Nobody called until Thursday because nobody knew she was on the floor." Max stayed beside her. "I know." David looked toward the window. The paramedic said he wouldn't move until they lifted her onto the stretcher. Then he followed them to the front door and stood there after the ambulance left. David had taken Max to the small apartment he shared with his wife. The building did not allow large dogs, but the manager granted him several days because of the emergency. Those days became 3 weeks. "My wife has severe arthritis," David said. "Some mornings, she can't close her hands around a coffee mug. We're on the 3rd floor, no yard. One elevator that works when it feels religious." Despite himself, Matthew almost smiled. David continued. Max had slept against the apartment door. He refused most food and rushed into the hall whenever he heard a cane, a walker, or a pair of hard shoes striking the tile. Each time Max searched the stranger's face. Each time he returned to the door and lay down again. "You could have found a foster home," Matthew said. David reached into his jacket and removed a folded packet of papers. He placed it on the table between them. Matthew opened it. There were handwritten names, phone numbers, dates, and short notes. German Shepherd Rescue, full. Church family, landlord refused. County foster network, no placement. Former coworker, 2 cats Max would not eat. Private boarding, too expensive. Another page contained email printouts from organizations in 3 neighboring counties. Some had replied kindly. Others had never replied at all. "I called 27 places," David said. "I drove him to 2 homes. At the first one, he lay by their front door for 7 hours. At the second, he wouldn't come out of the car." Matthew looked at the pages again. The list did not excuse everything, but it made judgment less convenient. "The building gave me a final notice," David continued. "Either the dog left or all 3 of us did. My mother's rehabilitation bills had started arriving. I work days managing inventory at a warehouse, and I take overnight shifts twice a week loading trucks. I couldn't lose the apartment. So you took him to the shelter? Yes, and visited once. David's hands tightened around the coffee cup. That's the part I can't explain without sounding like a coward. Try. When I came back, Max stood up before I reached his kennel. He looked behind me. He thought I'd brought her. David swallowed. When I left, he stayed at the gate and watched me walk all the way down the hall. I sat in my car for almost an hour. I told myself I'd return when I had better news. But you didn't. No. David finally looked directly at Matthew. Because I didn't have better news, and I couldn't stand letting him watch me leave again. Matthew had expected selfishness. What he found was shame. Less dramatic, more human, and harder to condemn cleanly. People often imagined abandonment as a door slammed without regret. Sometimes it was a door closed by someone who remained on the other side, hand still resting on the knob, too ashamed to open it again. Matthew's phone rang. The name on the screen was Emily. He almost let it go to voicemail, then answered. Hello? Dad, are you busy? Emily Brooks was 25, though Matthew still sometimes pictured her at 12, sitting on the kitchen counter while her mother cooked. She had inherited Matthew's blue-gray eyes and her mother's oval face, warm ivory skin and thick chestnut hair. As an adult, she wore her hair just below her shoulders and carried herself with an independence that looked natural until one noticed how rarely she asked anyone for help. Emily worked as a graphic designer in Cincinnati and spoke with measured calm whenever she expected disappointment. I have a few minutes, Matthew said. I wanted to tell you something before you heard it from somebody else. She paused. Nathan proposed last night. I said yes. Matthew sat straighter. When are you planning the wedding? We haven't decided. Have you looked at venues? Spring gets booked early. You need to set a budget before signing anything, and make sure the contracts include cancellation terms. Silence answered him. Emily? I called to tell my father I'm getting married. I know, I'm trying to help. No, you're building a checklist. Matthew glanced across the booth. David lowered his eyes, pretending not to listen. Emily's voice became quieter. You did the same thing when Mom died. You handled the hospital forms, you paid every bill, you organized the funeral down to the minute. Matthew's jaw tightened. Someone had to, I know. But after everyone left, I sat in my room alone. You were in the kitchen sorting receipts because you didn't know what to say to me. That isn't fair. No, it wasn't. The words landed before Matthew could defend himself. I wasn't asking you to fix anything, Emily said. I just needed you to sit with me. Matthew looked at the coffee cooling in front of him. He had no useful response, and usefulness had always been the shield he reached for first. I have to go, Emily said. I only wanted you to know. The call ended. David remained silent for several seconds. Then he folded the list of foster homes and pushed it back toward Matthew. Sometimes, David said, you think working harder proves you care. Then somebody tells you all they remember is that you weren't there. Matthew did not thank him for the observation. They drove separately to Maple Grove. The rehabilitation center was a low brick building surrounded by trimmed hedges and young maple trees stripped nearly bare by autumn. Inside, the corridors smelled of floor polish, hand lotion, and cooked vegetables. Wheelchairs lined one wall beside framed photographs of Kentucky horse farms. Helen Carter sat near a window in a quiet visiting room. The woman from Max's video had changed. At 79, Helen had always been small, but now she seemed almost weightless beneath a pale green cardigan. Her soft gray curls had been cut shorter for convenience, exposing a delicate forehead and narrow ears. One side of her face remained slightly slack from the stroke. Her left hand rested motionless in her lap, while the fingers of her right hand retained a limited, trembling strength. Yet her dark eyes were clear and attentive. Illness had weakened her body without making her absent. David bent and kissed her forehead. Mom, this is Matthew. He's been helping with Max. At the dog's name, Helen's eyes widened. Matthew sat where she could see him and opened a photograph on his phone. It showed Max lying near the kennel gate, his thin body turned toward the hallway. Helen stared at the screen. Her lips moved, but only a broken breath emerged. Frustration tightened her face. She lifted her right hand, struggled against the weight of her own arm, and tapped the plastic armrest of the wheelchair. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound was softer than Matthew expected. Still, he knew it immediately. Helen reached for the notepad on the table. David placed a pen between her fingers. Writing took nearly a minute. Each letter leaned uncertainly into the next, but she refused help until the sentence was finished. She turned the pad toward Matthew. "Max thinks I left him." Matthew read the words twice. In his mind, he heard Emily saying she had needed him to sit with her. He saw Max at the end of the shelter corridor, rising for every set of footsteps and lowering his head after every disappointment. One was a German shepherd waiting beside a full bowl. The other was a grown woman planning a wedding without knowing whether her father could enter a room without turning love into a task. Both were carrying the same unanswered question. Why was the person they loved still alive, yet never coming through the door? Cold sunlight returned to Lexington the next morning, pale and sharp against the wet streets. The rain had washed the dust from the city, but it had done nothing to clear Matthew Brooks's mind. Helen Carter's uneven handwriting followed him from Maple Grove to his silent house and then back to Bluegrass Animal Haven. Max thinks I left him. Matthew arrived before the shelter opened, carrying a legal pad filled with phone numbers, requirements, and names of people he intended to call. To him, the situation appeared painfully simple. Helen was alive. Max was waiting for Helen, therefore Max should be taken to her. Problems became bearable when reduced to steps. Matthew had built much of his adult life on that belief. Rachel Moore was standing behind the reception counter when he placed the legal pad in front of her. "We need to take Max to Maple Grove," he said. Rachel looked at the list before looking at him. "Eventually." "Today." "No." Matthew's jaw tightened. Rachel explained that Maple Grove required proof of current vaccinations, a veterinary health certificate, a behavioral assessment, and written approval from Helen's physician. Because Max was underweight and receiving assisted feeding, the shelter veterinarian also needed to determine whether the trip would place too much stress on him. The rehabilitation center had strict rules for visiting animals, particularly around elderly patients with weakened immune systems. 2 weeks. Rachel said, "possibly longer." Matthew stared at her as though she had suggested leaving Max in the kennel for a year. "He may not have 2 weeks. Which is exactly why we cannot create a crisis by rushing him into a strange building filled with wheelchairs, medication carts, and people who move unpredictably. He isn't dangerous. I know that. But frightened and exhausted animals do not need to be dangerous to become overwhelmed." Matthew picked up the legal pad. "Give me the number of whoever approves the visit." Rachel's expression hardened. "You do not get to turn every delay into an enemy." By noon, Matthew had called Maple Grove 4 times. He spoke first with reception, then with the rehabilitation floor, then with an administrative coordinator whose patient voice became noticeably less patient by the 3rd call. He asked whether the health certificate could be waived, whether the behavioral evaluation could be performed at Maple Grove, and whether Helen's physician could sign the approval before seeing the complete records. Each answer was some variation of no. Matthew did not shout, but he had spent years learning how to make calm words feel like pressure. By early afternoon, Maple Grove contacted Rachel directly and warned that continued interference could cause the request to be delayed or denied. Rachel found Matthew replacing a hinge near the laundry room. "Stop calling them." He did not turn around. "They're hiding behind procedure. They are protecting their patients. Max is starving, and if you push hard enough to get the entire request rejected, what exactly have you accomplished?" Matthew drove the final screw into the frame with more force than necessary. Rachel lowered her voice. "You are not the only person who cares what happens to him." That was the sentence that made him turn. Part of Matthew wanted to tell her that caring without immediate action was only a more respectable form of standing by. Another part remembered Emily saying that she had not needed him to fix anything. She had needed him to sit with her. Waiting had always felt passive to Matthew, almost shameful. In the military, waiting had purpose because it preceded movement. In ordinary grief, waiting offered no promise at all. It simply demanded that a person remain present while nothing improved. 2 weeks, he said. At least, Rachel replied. Then we use those 2 weeks properly. David Carter arrived late that afternoon carrying a paper grocery bag under one arm. He looked even more exhausted than he had at the diner. His warehouse shirt was wrinkled, the gray in his mustache more visible beneath the shelter's fluorescent lights, and there was a fresh scrape across one knuckle. He placed the bag on the counter and removed a folded shawl and a wooden cane. The shawl was deep blue wool, soft at the center and worn thin along the edges. A faint scent of lavender remained in the fabric, mixed with the clean, medicinal smell of Maple Grove. The cane was polished walnut with a curved handle darkened where Helen's hand had held it for years. Mom kept that shawl on the back of her chair, David said. Max slept beside it when she went to church. The cane stayed near the front door. Rachel examined both items before allowing Matthew to take them into the kennel area. Benny began barking the moment David entered, throwing himself against his gate with desperate enthusiasm. Max did not respond to David's footsteps. He remained beside his bowl, his eyes fixed toward the main corridor. But when Matthew held the shawl near the kennel door, Max's nose lifted. His body changed before he moved. The German Shepherd rose slowly, his legs unsteady beneath his thin frame, and came forward. Matthew placed the shawl on the floor rather than holding it out. Max lowered his head and breathed deeply into the wool. He pressed his muzzle against it, closed his eyes and remained there. David gripped the wire gate with both hands. He knows it. Matthew nodded. Max circled once, then lay down with one foreleg resting over the shawl. The food bowl remained untouched. For almost an hour, Max stayed beside Helen's shawl. Matthew watched from outside the kennel, struggling against the urge to turn recognition into progress. If the scent had reached Max, perhaps the sound would reach him further. The cane leaned against the wall several feet away. Matthew picked it up. Rachel, who had returned to the hallway, immediately understood what he intended. Don't! He responded to the sound before. He responded because he believed Helen was coming. Maybe it will encourage him. Or maybe it will make him wait for someone who is not here. Matthew looked at Max, then at the untouched food. A starving animal made caution feel like cowardice. He struck the rubber tip of the cane gently against the floor. Once. Max raised his head. Twice. His ears stood forward. 3 times. Max pushed himself upright and stepped over the shawl. He stared down the corridor. The shelter was quiet except for a washing machine turning in the back room. No small woman in a green cardigan appeared. No familiar voice called him handsome. Max waited, breathing faster, then looked behind Matthew toward the front doors. When nothing changed, the hope drained from his posture. He returned to the shawl but did not lie on it. Instead, he settled several inches away, facing the wall. David looked down at the floor. Matthew still held the cane in one hand. It felt heavier now. I thought it might help, he said. Rachel did not answer. She did not need to. Matthew carried the cane into the office and placed it inside a cabinet. He locked the door and gave Rachel the key. The next day, Matthew tried something that felt more difficult than calling officials or moving equipment. He did nothing. He completed his repairs, avoided Max's kennel until the late afternoon, and did not ask Rachel for updates every 20 minutes. When the shelter closed to visitors, he brought a folding chair into the corridor and placed it outside Max's gate. He did not carry Chicken in his hand. He did not say the dog's name. He turned the chair slightly so he was not facing Max directly, then unwrapped a turkey sandwich. Dorothy Lane appeared from the laundry room carrying 2 square plastic containers. Her silver-white hair had slipped loose around her temples, and her sunflower yellow sweater was partly hidden beneath an apron covered in paw prints. "I made too much soup," she said. Tragic household accident could happen to anyone with a pot and poor judgment. She handed one container to Matthew before sitting in a second chair. The soup was thick with potatoes, carrots, and chicken, and steam clouded the lid when he opened it. "You always make exactly one extra serving?" he asked. "I have a very precise kind of carelessness." Benny barked at them twice, then quieted when neither person moved toward him. Max remained beside Helen's shawl. They ate without speaking for several minutes. Dorothy eventually looked down at the container in her hands. "I still set out 2 plates sometimes." Matthew said nothing. Harold always sat at the end of the table because he claimed the chair had the best view of the television. It did not. He simply liked that chair. A faint smile touched her face and disappeared. "The first month after he died, I made enough food for both of us every night. Then I would remember, halfway through setting the table. I'd put one plate back in the cabinet, look at the other one, and lose my appetite." "How long did that last?" Matthew asked. "I'll let you know when it stops." Dorothy took another spoonful. She did not say that time healed everything. She was old enough to know time was not a doctor. It carried people forward whether they were ready or not, sometimes healing, sometimes merely increasing the distance from the day everything changed. Matthew did not tell her about his wife's empty chair, or the months when he had eaten standing over the kitchen sink, because sitting at the table felt like admitting no one else was coming. Dorothy did not ask. Their silence was not empty. It was a place where neither person had to perform recovery for the other. Inside the kennel, Max opened his eyes. He smelled the soup, the sandwich, and the warmed food in his bowl. Matthew saw the dog's ears move but kept his gaze lowered. He ate slowly, though the sandwich had gone dry. Every instinct told him to watch for improvement, to measure the distance between Max and the bowl, to reward the smallest movement. That instinct was not entirely kindness. Part of it was Matthew's need to witness proof that his presence mattered. Human beings often placed pressure on suffering creatures without realizing it. They leaned closer, offered encouragement, and waited for a response that would reassure them their help was working. The one in pain was then given another burden: make the helper feel useful. Benny moved to the dividing wall and curled against it, his small white and tan body becoming still. Max looked toward the terrier, then toward Matthew. No one called him. No cane struck the floor. No hand entered the kennel carrying an expectation. After several minutes, Max lifted his head. He placed one paw beneath himself, then the other, and rose. Dorothy stopped moving, her spoon halfway to her mouth. Matthew continued looking at his soup. Max walked to the bowl. He sniffed the food and glanced at Matthew as if waiting for the command that usually turned hunger into a test. None came. Max lowered his head and took one small bite. His jaw worked slowly. He paused. Matthew's hands tightened around the plastic spoon, but he did not turn. Max ate a second bite, then a third. Dorothy silently lowered her spoon. Benny remained pressed against the wall. The corridor held no celebration, no praise, and no sudden promise that everything would now be easier. Max stopped after eating roughly 1/4 of the bowl. He returned to Helen's shawl, circled once, and lay down. His breathing settled. Matthew waited another minute before glancing toward the food. For the first time since entering Bluegrass Animal Haven, Max had chosen to eat without being assisted, commanded, or persuaded. Matthew had not made him do it. He had only stopped turning the meal into another place where the grieving dog could fail. The first hard frost silvered the lawns of Lexington before sunrise, whitening the edges of fallen leaves and turning every parked car into a dull mirror. 2 weeks had passed since Max ate from his bowl without being ordered, praised, or watched too closely. His progress remained uneven. Some mornings he managed nearly half a meal. On others, he only sniffed the food before returning to Helen's blue shawl. He had gained a little strength, though his ribs still showed beneath his black and tan coat, and his steps remained careful, as if his body no longer trusted the ground to support it. Matthew Brooks had learned not to call each setback a failure, but the lesson irritated him almost as much as the setbacks themselves. He preferred straight roads, visible targets, and results that could be measured. Max offered none of those things. The German Shepherd moved forward in inches and backward in memories. That morning, however, every form had finally been signed. Max's vaccinations had been updated, his health certificate approved, and his behavior around wheelchairs, rolling carts, unfamiliar voices, and sudden movement had been carefully observed. Maple Grove had granted them 30 minutes in its enclosed garden. Rachel Moore reviewed the rules twice, while Matthew fitted a plain leather leash to Max's collar. "No pulling him toward Helen," she said. "No crowding him. If he wants distance, he gets distance." Matthew checked the buckle. "You've mentioned that." "I'm mentioning it again, because you have the face of a man planning to solve 30 minutes in the first 30 seconds. Dorothy Lane stood nearby, holding Helen's folded shawl. Her silver hair had been pinned more securely than usual, though several stubborn strands still curled around her forehead. "That face could pressure a toaster into confessing," she said. Matthew ignored her, which Dorothy considered proof that the joke had landed. Max entered the transport van willingly, but he did not settle. He stood with his nose near the window, watching the city pass in blurred pieces: brick houses, traffic lights, bare trees, people carrying coffee into warm buildings. Matthew sat beside him without touching him. Every few minutes, Max glanced toward the front of the van, then back at the road disappearing behind them. The dog did not understand appointments, medical clearance, or the difference between a temporary visit and a return home. Human beings like to believe explanations softened loss, but explanations only worked for creatures who understood language. Even then, they did not always help. Matthew had explained his wife's treatment schedule to Emily years earlier. He had explained test results, medication changes, insurance forms, and funeral arrangements. He had been clear, accurate, and emotionally absent. Facts had filled every room while his daughter sat alone inside them. Max did not need facts that morning. He needed the world to stop changing long enough for one familiar thing to become real again. The enclosed garden at Maple Grove lay behind the rehabilitation wing, surrounded by a wooden privacy fence and low brick walls. Winter pansies filled raised planters, their purple and yellow faces bright against the cold. A covered patio sheltered several metal chairs and a small table. Helen Carter waited beneath it in her wheelchair, a pale green blanket folded over her knees. She looked smaller than Matthew remembered from the previous visit. Her grey curls had been brushed neatly away from her narrow face, but the stroke still pulled one side of her mouth lower than the other. Her left hand rested motionless beneath the blanket. Her right hand trembled against the wheelchair armrest. David stood behind her, with both hands on the chair handles. He wore a clean blue shirt instead of his warehouse jacket, though exhaustion still darkened the skin beneath his eyes. Rachel positioned herself several feet to one side, carrying a pouch of Max's usual food. Dorothy had come in a second car to return Helen's shawl and offer what she called quiet supervision, though quiet was rarely her natural condition. When Matthew led Max through the garden gate, the dog stopped. Everyone had expected movement. David had imagined Max pulling free and racing across the stones. Rachel had prepared herself to slow him down. Even Matthew, despite every warning he had received and repeated to himself, had pictured recognition arriving instantly. Instead, Max stood just inside the gate, with one front paw slightly raised. His ears angled forward, but his tail remained still. He stared at Helen. She smelled partly familiar. Lavender remained in the shawl around her shoulders, and beneath the clean scent of soap there was still something that belonged to the woman who had shared his home. But other odors surrounded her now. Antiseptic, medication, vinyl, laundry detergent, the faint metallic trace of the wheelchair. Her body had changed. She no longer stood behind a wooden cane. She no longer crossed a doorway carrying groceries and calling him handsome. The person Max had waited for was in front of him, yet not in the shape memory had promised. "Max," David said softly, "it's her." Max looked at David, then at Matthew. Rachel removed a small piece of chicken from her pouch and placed it on the paving stones near Helen's feet. Max saw it, but did not move. Helen tried to speak. Her lips shaped the beginning of his name, but the sound emerged broken and thin. Pain tightened her face, not physical pain alone, but the humiliation of knowing exactly what she wanted to say, while her own body refused to carry it into the world. Matthew felt the leash become taut as Max shifted his weight backward. Instinct moved through Matthew before thought did. One small pull, gentle but firm, might guide the dog closer. One step could begin the reunion everyone had worked to arrange. His fingers shortened the leash. Then he remembered Max standing over the bowl while no one watched. Matthew loosened his grip. The leather line fell into a soft curve between them. He stepped backward, giving Max room to make a choice that did not belong to anyone else. David called the dog again. "Come on, boy. Go see her." Max remained still. "Don't," Rachel said quietly. "Let him decide." Helen's eyes moved from Max to her son. Tears had already gathered along her lower lashes. She raised her right hand from the armrest. The effort made her shoulders shake. Her fingers curled, and for 1 second Matthew thought she did not have enough strength. Then her knuckles touched the hard plastic. One tap. Max's ears lifted. Helen swallowed and tapped again. 2. The garden seemed to hold its breath. Her third tap was weaker than the others, almost lost beneath the distant sound of a delivery truck. 3. Max lowered his raised paw. He took 1 step forward. Helen's breath caught. David gripped the wheelchair handles more tightly, while Rachel turned her face slightly away, as if privacy could still exist with 5 people watching. Max paused after every step. He moved neither like a joyful pet rushing home, nor like a trained dog obeying a command. He moved like a creature crossing the distance between what he remembered and what remained. When he reached Helen, he sniffed the blanket over her knees. Then he moved closer to her motionless left hand, breathing in the scent of her skin. Helen tried to bend toward him but could not. Max looked up at her altered face. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then Max lowered his head and rested it across her knees. Helen's right hand came down against the dull fur between his ears. Her fingers could not stroke him properly. They only rested there, trembling. Max did not wag his tail. He did not bark, jump, lick her face, or perform the kind of joy people expected from reunion videos. Helen made no speech. She could not. Tears slipped down her face without sound, and Max closed his eyes beneath her hand. The stillness was not disappointment. It was recognition too deep for celebration. They remained that way while the frost melted from the garden stones. David stepped away from the wheelchair and stood near Dorothy at the edge of the patio. His voice was barely audible. "I thought he wouldn't know her." Dorothy looked at Max and Helen rather than at him. "He knows. I was afraid he'd see how different she is and turn away." David rubbed both hands over his face. "Then I thought maybe he'd recognize her but wouldn't need her anymore. Maybe I waited too long." "That would have been easier for you, wouldn't it?" Dorothy asked. David lowered his hands. She did not say it cruelly. Dorothy's voice carried the plain honesty of someone old enough to know that comfort and truth were not always the same thing. "If he didn't need her," she continued, "you wouldn't have to feel guilty for keeping them apart." David stared at the paving stones. "I did what I could." "I believe you. That doesn't sound like forgiveness. It isn't mine to give." Dorothy folded her arms against the cold. "Love doesn't automatically teach people what to do when life falls apart. Sometimes people love deeply and still choose badly. But shame can't become an excuse to stay gone, not forever." David looked toward his mother. Helen's hand remained on Max's head. "I didn't come back to the shelter because I couldn't watch him look behind me for her." "So you made sure he had no one to look at?" The sentence hurt. Dorothy let it hurt. Some truths were useless if wrapped so gently that no one could feel their shape. David nodded slowly. "I'll come next week." Dorothy glanced at him. "Not because you want to feel better. No. Because he needs to know people can return." David's voice roughened. "I'll come every week." The 30 minutes ended without anyone wanting to announce it. Matthew guided Max away only after Helen's hand slipped from his head with fatigue. Max resisted for a moment, not by pulling but by planting his feet and looking back. Helen raised 2 fingers in a small farewell. David promised her they would return the following Wednesday. Whether she understood every word was uncertain, but her eyes remained fixed on Max until the garden gate closed. Back at Bluegrass Animal Haven, Matthew expected Max to return immediately to Helen's shawl. Instead, the German Shepherd walked into his kennel, paused beside the full bowl, and looked down the hallway. He waited several seconds, perhaps listening for the van, the wheelchair, or 3 faint taps that could not reach him from Maple Grove. Then Max lowered his head and began to eat. He finished nearly half the bowl. Twice he stopped and looked toward the door. Each time he returned to the food without anyone calling him back. Matthew remained outside the kennel and said nothing. He understood now that the reunion had not restored Max to the dog in Helen's old video. It had not returned Helen to her house, repaired her body, or erased 6 weeks of confusion. Max had found the person he loved, only to discover that love could survive while the life built around it changed beyond recognition. Helen was alive, but the old doorway, the wooden cane, and the woman who once entered carrying groceries might never return in the same way. For that day, the truth was painful. It was also enough to make Max eat. Early winter settled over Lexington in a pattern of pale mornings and long, cold evenings. The trees around Bluegrass Animal Haven had lost nearly every leaf, and the shelter yard had turned brown beneath a thin skin of frost. A new rhythm had formed around Max. Every Wednesday, Matthew Brooks and David Carter drove him to Maple Grove to visit Helen. On the other days, Matthew arrived at the shelter shortly before the evening meal, placed a folding chair outside the kennel, and sat nearby without directing the dog toward the bowl. Max no longer needed silence every time he ate, but Matthew kept the routine because consistency was one of the few promises an animal could understand without words. David kept his promise too. He came every Wednesday, even after overnight warehouse shifts left his eyes red and his shoulders slumped beneath his jacket. He brought Helen fresh clothes, helped the nurses adjust her wheelchair, and stayed after Max was returned to the shelter. David still carried shame, but he had begun to understand that guilt was only useful when it led a person back through the door. Helen's recovery remained slow. She could shape a few sounds now, though Max's name still arrived as little more than breath. Her right hand had grown stronger, and the 3 taps against the wheelchair armrest no longer required as much effort. Max responded every time, but the old desperation had softened. He still raised his ears at the sound of canes and walkers in the halls, yet he no longer lunged toward every stranger. He had begun to distinguish memory from reality. At the shelter, he ate more steadily and had gained several pounds. His ribs remained visible, but a thin layer of muscle was returning along his shoulders. During short walks in the yard, he sometimes stopped to smell frozen grass or watch birds gathering on the fence. These were small actions, easy for humans to dismiss because they did not look like triumph. Rachel Moore did not dismiss them. "A dog entirely the world is considering staying in it," she told Matthew one afternoon. Benny had become part of that world. The small terrier still greeted visitors as if each person were arriving specifically to hear his opinion, but his frantic spinning had decreased. When Max lay against the dividing wall, Benny settled on the opposite side, his narrow white and tan body pressed close to the concrete. At night, when another dog barked at a passing truck or thunder rolled beyond the shelter roof, Benny moved toward Max instead of throwing himself against the gate. Max began doing the same. He would rise from Helen's folded shawl, cross the kennel, and lie near the wall until Benny stopped trembling. Neither dog could see the other, but they felt movement and warmth through the barrier.
Human beings liked to describe one animal as strong and another as needy, as if comfort traveled in only one direction.
Yet Max's stillness calmed Benny, and Benny's noisy presence reminded Max that the world had not gone completely silent. The loud dog and the quiet dog had become witnesses for each other. Dorothy Lane noticed before anyone else. She began spending more time beside Benny's kennel after finishing the laundry. She complained about his barking, his habit of pushing his water bowl across the floor, and the way his wiry fur attached itself to every dark piece of clothing she owned. Then she started bringing him a small blanket from home. A week later, Rachel found Dorothy filling out adoption paperwork at the reception desk. "This is temporary," Dorothy announced. Her red reading glasses sat low on her nose, and her silver-white hair was tied into a bun that had already begun to loosen. "He is only staying with me until we locate someone with unusual patience and very poor hearing." Rachel glanced at the adoption form. "You signed the permanent adoption section. That form is unnecessarily judgmental." Matthew stood nearby, repairing a cabinet hinge. "You've chosen him." Dorothy pointed her pen at him. "I have chosen to prevent the rest of the county from suffering." Benny barked from the kennel row as if endorsing the decision. The day Dorothy took him home, she arrived wearing a red wool coat and carrying a leash, a small dog bed, 2 toys, and enough supplies for an expedition across the state. Benny seemed to understand something unusual was happening. He bounced against the gate while Rachel fastened the leash, then ran in a crooked circle around Dorothy's legs. Dorothy laughed, scolded him, nearly lost hold of the leash and laughed again. Max stood at his own gate, watching. Benny pulled toward him, whining. Rachel allowed the 2 dogs to meet briefly in the exercise yard. Benny rushed beneath Max's chest, sniffed his legs, then licked the side of his muzzle with no respect for dignity. Max did not play, but he lowered his head and touched his nose to Benny's shoulder. It lasted only a moment. Then Dorothy led Benny toward the lobby. The terrier looked back twice before disappearing through the door. Max remained standing. That afternoon he moved to the dividing wall and stared into Benny's empty kennel. The little blanket was gone. The water bowl had been removed. No paws scratched the concrete on the other side. Max stayed there through the sounds of cleaning, feeding, and visitors leaving. When Matthew arrived at the usual time, Max did not come toward the bowl. He did not touch the food. He simply faced the empty space where another familiar creature had been and waited for evidence that the disappearance made sense. Matthew carried his folding chair into the hallway, but did not sit. "Call Dorothy," he told Rachel. "Ask her to bring Benny back." Rachel was updating a medication chart. "No." "Max has stopped eating again." "For 1 meal. That is how it started before." "No, before Helen vanished, and Max received no explanation, no visit, and no predictable return. This is different. Max doesn't know that. He has to learn it." Matthew looked toward the kennels. "You want him to suffer through it?" "I want him to discover that separation can end without becoming abandonment." Rachel set down her pen. "We cannot keep every person and animal Max cares about in the same room forever. Protecting him from all departures will not make him secure. It will teach him that his fear is correct, that if he lets anything matter, it must never leave." Matthew disliked the argument because it asked him to tolerate pain instead of removing it. His first instinct was always to shorten the distance between danger and action. But Max's life could not be built inside a room where no door ever closed. Dorothy's first night with Benny offered no evidence that Rachel's confidence was justified. The terrier explored her house as if conducting an urgent investigation. He ran down the hallway, barked at his reflection in the dark television screen, dragged one of Dorothy's slippers beneath the dining table, and refused the expensive dog bed she had purchased. Near midnight, Benny disappeared into the spare room. Dorothy found him beneath Harold's old armchair, pulling a gray wool sock from the shadows. Her husband had worn those socks every winter. Dorothy had left several pairs in the bottom drawer because throwing them away felt too much like agreeing that he would never need them again. "Drop it," she told Benny. He shook the sock once and backed farther under the chair. Dorothy knelt with difficulty, reached for him, and bumped her shoulder against the furniture. "You are an ungrateful little criminal!" Benny emerged carrying the sock proudly and ran into the living room. Dorothy followed, first angry, then laughing despite herself. The sound startled her. She had heard laughter from the television, from women at church, and from visitors who lowered their voices whenever they asked how she was doing. But she had not heard her own laughter fill the house in months. Benny dropped the sock in the middle of the rug and looked up, tail moving so fast that his entire body leaned from side to side. Dorothy sat down on the floor. The laughter broke apart. She covered her mouth and began to cry. Benny approached cautiously, placed one paw on her knee, then climbed into her lap without invitation. He did not know Harold. He did not understand the sock, the empty chair, or why a woman could laugh and grieve in the same breath. He only knew she was on the floor and no longer sounded like herself. Dorothy held his small, wiry body against her chest. Benny could not replace the man who had shared 46 years of her life. That was not what love asked of him. He brought crumbs, noise, wet paw prints, and the inconvenience of needing breakfast before sunrise. He gave Dorothy a reason to open the curtains in the morning and return home before darkness filled the rooms. Sometimes new life entered a grieving house without asking permission and immediately stole a sock. The next afternoon, Dorothy returned to Bluegrass Animal Haven with Benny on a blue leash. The terrier burst through the lobby, dragging her sideways. "He has been removed from my home for disciplinary review," she announced. Benny raced down the kennel corridor, knocked over a water bowl, barked at a mop leaning against the wall, and nearly wrapped the leash around Matthew's knees. Max stood at the first sound of Benny's bark. His ears came forward. He moved to the gate as Benny reached him, whining and hopping in place. Rachel opened the exercise yard, and the two dogs spent nearly an hour together. Benny ran in uneven circles while Max followed at a slower pace. Once, the terrier stumbled over his own feet and rolled onto his back. Max stopped above him, and Benny sneezed directly into the German shepherd's face. Dorothy laughed so loudly that even Rachel smiled. Then the hour ended. Dorothy clipped on Benny's leash. Max watched them walk toward the lobby. His body became still, but he did not press himself against the gate. Benny looked back once, barked, and disappeared through the door for the second time. Max waited. Matthew stood several feet away, prepared to take out the folding chair. He stopped before touching it. Minutes passed. Max looked at Benny's empty kennel, then toward the main entrance. Nothing returned immediately. The door remained closed. At last, Max turned away from it. He walked to his bowl and began to eat. Matthew stayed where he was. Max did not look toward him for reassurance. He ate slowly, paused once to listen, then continued without anyone sitting beside him. No one had explained what had happened. No person could tell Max that Benny now slept in Dorothy's house or that the terrier would visit again. But Max had seen Benny leave. Then Max had seen Benny return, and when the small dog left a second time, the absence no longer meant the world had ended. Some creatures walked out of a room and still remembered the way back. Winter deepened over Lexington beneath a clear white sky, and the cold sharpened every sound around Bluegrass Animal Haven. The click of kennel latches, the scrape of boots, the distant barking that rose and fell behind the walls. Nearly 2 months had passed since Matthew Brooks first noticed the untouched bowl at the end of the corridor. Max no longer looked like a dog disappearing by degrees. His black and tan coat had begun to recover its natural shine. A thin layer of muscle had returned along his shoulders, and his ribs no longer seemed to press so urgently against the skin. He still ate slowly, sometimes pausing to listen toward the main door, but most evenings the bowl was nearly empty before the shelter lights dimmed. Every Wednesday, Matthew and David took him to Maple Grove. Helen's right hand had grown steadier, and the 3 taps against her wheelchair armrest now came with less effort. Max rested his head on her knees during each visit, yet everyone understood that Helen would not be returning to her old house soon. Her rehabilitation could last many months. Even afterward, she might require more care than she could receive alone. Max needed somewhere to live beyond the shelter. Rachel began reviewing adoption applications. Susan Parker arrived on a Saturday afternoon, wearing a camel-colored wool coat, practical brown boots, and a dark green scarf tucked neatly around her neck. At 67, she was tall and slender, with fair skin, clear gray eyes, and silver hair cut into a smooth, chin-length bob. Her face was composed rather than soft, though fine lines around her eyes suggested she laughed more often than strangers first assumed. Susan had worked for 35 years as a public librarian, a profession that had suited her patient manner and dislike of unnecessary noise. He had been widowed 4 years earlier and lived alone in a quiet brick house on 3 fenced acres outside Lexington. She had raised 2 German shepherds with her late husband, both of whom had lived into old age. The second had died the previous spring. Susan did not speak of that loss dramatically. She simply said the house felt too large now, especially at dusk. On paper, Susan was nearly perfect. She had experience with the breed, financial stability, a secure yard, no other pets, and enough time to manage Max's visits to Helen. She had already spoken with David and promised that Maple Grove would remain part of Max's routine. Rachel introduced her without ceremony. Max stood at the gate, observing Susan with the thoughtful caution he gave unfamiliar people. Susan did not crouch over him or push her hand toward his face. She sat sideways on the floor outside the kennel, removed one glove, and placed a piece of food on her open palm. "I've met shepherds who believed good manners were a rumor," she said. "You appear more civilized." Max stepped forward and took the food. Susan smiled but did not reach for him. During their first walk in the yard, Max moved beside her without pulling. Susan allowed him to stop at the fence and inspect the tracks of a squirrel in the frost. When she sat on a bench, he lowered himself several feet away. There was no fear in his posture, no refusal. Rachel watched from the doorway with quiet approval. Matthew watched too. He should have felt relieved. Susan offered exactly what Max needed: space, patience, routine, and a home that did not depend on a temporary shelter schedule. Yet something restless moved beneath Matthew's ribs as he saw Max glance toward him across the yard. Matthew stepped back inside. Max rose immediately. Susan noticed. "Does he always follow him?" Rachel answered carefully. "He notices when Matthew leaves." "It isn't the same thing," Matthew said. Susan looked at him with the level gaze of a woman who had spent decades helping people find books while pretending not to notice what they were really searching for. Perhaps not. Over the next week, Susan visited 3 more times. Max accepted food from her, walked beside her, and once rested his chin briefly on the toe of her boot. Each visit went well, until Matthew moved toward the lobby. Then Max stood, ears forward, and followed him with his eyes. Rachel arranged a trial afternoon at Susan's house. Max would spend several hours there before returning to the shelter. Matthew drove the van because Max had learned to settle when he was nearby, though Rachel warned him not to remain inside the house. Susan's property lay beyond a row of horse farms, where bare trees bordered a wide yard enclosed by a sturdy wooden fence. The house was clean but not delicate. An old dog bed remained beside the fireplace, and framed photographs of Susan's previous shepherds stood on a bookshelf. One showed a black and tan male with a gray muzzle lying beside Susan's late husband, a broad-faced man with suspenders and an enormous smile. Max walked through every room without panic. He sniffed the bed, drank from a ceramic bowl, and stood at the back door while Susan opened it to the yard. Outside, he explored the fence line and watched 2 horses moving in the neighboring field. Everything appeared promising. Then Matthew returned to the van. Max followed him to the front door. "I'll be back in 3 hours," Matthew said, although the words meant nothing to the dog. Max watched the van leave through the narrow glass panel beside the door. He did not bark or scratch. He simply lay down against the threshold. Susan offered food an hour later, Max turned his head away. She took him into the yard. He returned to the same place beside the door. When Matthew came back, Max stood before the van had fully stopped. He moved toward Matthew, not wildly, but with a certainty that made Susan look away for a moment. He was not frightened, she explained. He was not destructive. He was waiting. I told him I'd return. Susan gave him a faint, sad smile. Then perhaps he believed you. Back at the shelter, Rachel waited until Susan had left before speaking. You should foster him. Matthew looked toward Max's kennel. No. 90 days. My house is small. He has lived in a kennel. My schedule changes. You have adjusted it for 2 months. I am not the right person for a dog that needs stability. Rachel folded her arms. You come here at the same time every day. You take him to Maple Grove every Wednesday. He eats when you are present and waits when you leave. What part of that looks unstable to him? Matthew's voice hardened. Susan has land, experience, and time. She is better equipped. This is not an equipment problem. She is the responsible choice. She may be. But Max did not spend the afternoon waiting for her. Matthew turned away. Dogs attach to routines. Rachel followed him into the corridor. Then why are you so determined to remove yourself from his? He stopped. Rachel's voice became quieter. You stay while something is broken because broken things give you a job. The moment the work becomes a relationship, you begin looking for the exit. You know nothing about my relationships. I know you arrived for 3 days and stayed 2 months. I know you have rearranged your entire life for this dog while insisting none of it means anything permanent. Matthew felt anger rise, because anger was easier to carry than recognition. He needs someone who will not fail him. Then stop deciding in advance that you will. Matthew left before she could say more. That evening, Emily called. Are you coming to the wedding? She asked. Matthew stood in his dark kitchen, one hand resting against the counter. His first instinct was to ask for the date, the hotel information, and what time he should arrive. He swallowed the questions. Yes, he said, I want to. Emily was silent. Matthew continued before courage became another thing he postponed. After your mother died, I looked at you and saw everything I couldn't save. You had her eyes, her expressions, sometimes even the way you stood in a doorway. His voice roughened. I told myself I was giving you room. The truth is, I kept my distance because being near you hurt. That was not strength, Emily said. No, it felt like you left too. I know. You don't get to make that better by finally admitting it. I know that too. Emily's breath trembled through the phone. Your pain did not make mine smaller. It just meant both of us were hurting in separate rooms. Matthew closed his eyes. He wanted to explain how lost he had been, how every conversation felt like stepping onto ground that might collapse. Instead, he listened. Emily spoke about birthdays he had attended physically but not emotionally, holidays filled with practical gifts and careful distance, and the years she stopped calling because every attempt ended with advice instead of comfort. Matthew did not defend himself. When the call ended, the kitchen seemed larger than before. Near midnight, he returned to Bluegrass Animal Haven. Rachel's truck was still outside. She let him in without asking why he had come. Max had not touched his dinner. Matthew opened the kennel door and placed the leash on the concrete. Then he sat just outside the threshold, leaving the doorway clear. He did not call Max. He did not offer food. He did not promise a yard, a perfect schedule, or a future without mistakes. Max remained beside Helen's shawl, watching him. Minutes passed. Matthew placed one hand flat on the floor, close enough to be seen but not close enough to demand contact. At last, Max rose. He crossed the kennel slowly, stepped over the leash, and passed through the open door. Then he sat beside Matthew, his thin shoulder resting against the former soldier's arm. Matthew did not reach for him. For once, the soldier had not selected the mission. The dog had chosen the person who would have to learn how to stay. Late winter softened over Lexington in small, uncertain ways. Frost still whitened the roofs before sunrise, but water had begun to run beneath the thinning ice along the curbs, and the first green shoots pushed through the dead grass behind Matthew Brooks's house. On the morning Max came home, there was no music, no crowd waiting on the porch, and no moment that looked ready to become a photograph. Matthew carried one bag of dog food through the kitchen, while Max stood just inside the front door, his black and tan body tense beneath a coat that had finally regained some of its shine. The 90-day foster agreement lay folded in Matthew's jacket pocket. Rachel had called it a trial placement. Matthew understood the phrase. A trial had rules, a time limit, and a decision at the end. Those things were easier to accept than the idea that another living creature might now depend on him. Max inspected the house slowly. It was a small, one-story home with plain furniture, clean counters, and walls that held almost no decoration. Matthew had lived there for 3 years, yet it still looked like a place someone intended to leave. A framed photograph of his wife and Emily stood on a bookshelf, half hidden behind a stack of unopened mail. Max paused before it, sniffed the wooden frame, then continued into the hallway. Matthew had placed a thick dog bed near the fireplace and another beside his bedroom door. Max ignored both. That first night, he paced from room to room, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor. He checked the windows, returned repeatedly to the front entrance, and finally lay across the threshold with his body pressed against the door. Matthew woke 3 times and found him there. On the 4th night, Matthew arrived home nearly an hour later than usual after helping repair a broken pipe at the shelter. Max was waiting behind the door, not barking or scratching, but standing rigidly with his ears forward. The food Matthew had left in the bowl remained untouched. He set down his keys and tried to use the calm, commanding voice that had once made uncertain men move through danger. "Max, eat." The dog looked at him and then toward the window. Matthew pointed to the bowl. "Go on." Max did not move. Frustration rose quickly. Matthew had rearranged his schedule, purchased food, prepared the house, and followed every instruction Rachel had given him. A part of him believed effort should purchase progress. When Max refused to eat, it felt like evidence that Matthew had already failed. "Enough," he said sharply. "You're safe here." Max lowered his body, not in obedience but in retreat. His eyes remained fixed on Matthew while the room grew tense around them. Matthew heard Rachel's voice in his memory. "You stay while something is broken because broken things give you a job." He also heard Emily saying, "I only needed you to sit with me." The command died in his throat. Matthew pulled out a kitchen chair and placed it several feet from the bowl. He sat down without removing his coat. He did not call Max again. For nearly 20 minutes, neither of them moved. The clock above the stove ticked loudly, each second reminding Matthew how badly he wanted the waiting to end. Eventually, Max crossed the room and lay near his boots. He still did not eat that night, but Matthew remained in the chair until the dog fell asleep. The following morning, Max finished breakfast. Their progress developed in uneven circles. For several days, Max slept beside Matthew's bedroom door. Then a passing delivery truck woke him before dawn, and he returned to the front entrance for 3 nights. He began following Matthew into the kitchen but stopped eating when a repair job delayed the evening routine. Some afternoons he carried a rubber ball across the yard and seemed almost playful. On others he stood beneath the bare maple tree, listening to sounds no one else noticed. Matthew did not become patient all at once. He still spoke too sharply when he was tired. He sometimes tried to move Max through fear, as though fear were merely an obstacle on a schedule. Yet the difference was what happened afterward. Matthew no longer left the room. He sat nearby, allowed the silence to remain uncomfortable, and waited until Max chose to move again. Every Wednesday they drove to Maple Grove. David Carter kept his promise and rarely missed a visit, even when overnight work left his shirt wrinkled and his eyes red. He had begun bringing Max small pieces of cooked chicken and no longer looked away when the dog watched him leave. Helen's recovery remained slow, but her right arm had grown stronger. With the help of a physical therapist, she could rise from the wheelchair for several seconds while holding a support rail. Her speech returned in fragments, single words shaped with enormous effort. "Good," she whispered once when Max placed his head on her knees. Another week she managed, "My boy." The words were rough and incomplete, but Max recognized her voice beneath what illness had changed. His tail moved once against the floor. Not a joyful sweep, just one quiet answer. At home, the empty rooms began to acquire evidence of another life. Dog hair gathered beneath the table. A water bowl left pale rings on the kitchen tile. Max pushed one of Matthew's boots beneath the sofa and refused to explain himself. The second dog bed remained unused because Max preferred sleeping near Matthew's bedroom door, but the house no longer resembled a place waiting to be abandoned. Dorothy Lane also developed a new schedule. He began taking Benny to a weekly blanket-making group in the church basement. The women gathered around folding tables covered with fabric, yarn, coffee cups, and half-finished quilts intended for hospital patients and families in temporary housing. Benny considered the entire arrangement a personal amusement park. He crawled under chairs, stole loose scraps of fleece, and once dragged a ball of red yarn beneath 3 tables, tying the ankles of 2 women together before anyone understood what had happened. Dorothy scolded him while laughing so hard she had to remove her glasses. The other women complained loudly and began saving treats for him. Benny began saving treats for him. Benny did not make Dorothy forget Harold. His old armchair still stood near the living room window, and some evenings she touched the worn fabric before turning off the lamp. But now she opened the curtains each morning because Benny barked at birds in the yard. He returned home before dark because a small terrier expected dinner and acted as though starvation began 3 minutes after sunset. Grief had not left her house. It had simply been forced to share the rooms with noise. Near the end of the foster period, an envelope arrived for Matthew. Emily's handwriting appeared across the front. Inside was a cream-colored wedding invitation and a short note. "There is a seat for you in the first row. I am not ready for you to walk me down the aisle. Please understand that. But I would like you there. Could you bring Mom's watch? I want to wear it." Matthew read the message twice. His wife's silver wristwatch had remained in a drawer since her death. The battery had stopped years earlier, but Matthew had never thrown it away or repaired it. For a long time he believed leaving it untouched preserved something. Now he understood that grief sometimes disguised fear as loyalty. A stopped watch did not keep the past safe. It only proved that time had moved without asking permission. He placed the invitation beside the family photograph rather than hiding it beneath the mail. Then he sat on the floor near Max, who rested with one paw across Matthew's boot. It was not forgiveness. Emily had not erased the years when her father occupied the same rooms without truly being present. The first row seat was not an invitation to pretend their family had remained whole. It was simply a door no longer locked. When the 90 days ended, Rachel came to Matthew's house carrying an adoption folder. Her auburn hair had been pulled into a practical knot, and snowmelt darkened the shoulders of her navy jacket. She found Max asleep beside Matthew's chair, his body relaxed, his ribs now hidden beneath returning muscle. In the kitchen, the evening bowl was empty. Rachel placed the papers on the table. "You can still say no." Matthew looked down at Max. "Can he?" He said no to Susan's house. He waited by the door. He was waiting for you. Matthew signed the forms without making a speech. No one took a photograph. Rachel gathered the papers, checked Max's weight, and reminded Matthew about the next veterinary appointment. The signature did not create a home. It only confirmed what Max had decided when he walked through the open kennel door and sat beside a man who was afraid to be needed. Their final visit of winter came on a mild Wednesday afternoon. Sunlight entered Maple Grove through the tall windows, catching dust in the air and warming the floor beside Helen's wheelchair. David stood near the window. Matthew remained just outside the doorway, while Max waited in the hall. Helen lifted her right hand. Her knuckles touched the armrest. "1,"
Max's ears rose. 2. Helen tried for the third tap, but fatigue overtook her. Her fingers trembled and fell back into her lap. The third sound never came. Max stood anyway. He crossed the room without waiting for Matthew, David, or any command. He approached Helen, rested his head across her knees, and closed his eyes. Helen's hand settled weakly between his ears. Matthew watched from the doorway. Months earlier, he would have entered immediately. He would have straightened Helen's blanket, checked the wheelchair brake, moved the water glass closer, or searched for some practical task that could protect him from standing still. This time, he repaired nothing. He simply stayed. Helen still could not return to her old house. Emily and Matthew still carried years of conversations that had not yet happened. Max still woke some nights and looked toward the front door before returning to sleep beside Matthew's room. But none of them had to wait alone anymore. Perhaps healing was not hearing all 3 knocks. Sometimes it was learning to step toward love even when the final sound never came. Max's story reminds us that not every wound asks to be fixed. Some wounds ask for patience, presence, and the courage to stay when there is nothing useful left to say. People often mistake action for love. We give advice, make plans, and search for quick answers because another person's pain makes us uncomfortable. But sometimes the holiest thing we can do is sit beside someone and refuse to leave. The miracle was not that Max suddenly forgot his grief. It was that God placed imperfect people along his path, each willing to return one more time. Healing came through ordinary choices, an open door, a quiet meal, a weekly visit, and a man learning that love is not a mission to complete. Perhaps God's miracles rarely arrive with thunder. Perhaps they appear when a frightened heart takes one more step before the third knock comes. If this story touched you, share it with someone who may be waiting for a reason to trust again. Tell us in the comments about a person or animal who taught you how to stay, and subscribe for more stories of hope, faith, and second chances. May God bless your home, comfort every lonely heart within it, and guide all who are still finding their way back to love.